Our subject is fools. And I want you to do something with me this morning. I want to go through the New Testament as well as the Old and see and read what God says about fools. We do not have enough time this morning to do that. Quite frankly, it would take us several days. But we're going to look at a sample of what God says. Let's start in the Old Testament. And the best place I know to start in the Old Testament is in the book of Proverbs. There are dozens and dozens of examples about the characteristic of fools in the book of Proverbs. We're going to just look at a handful quickly. Let's start in verse 10. In verse 10, chapter 10, I'll get it in a moment. Verse 18. And by the way, there are several statements about fools in the 10th chapter, but I've just picked out one. Verse 18 of chapter 10 of the book of Proverbs, he that hideth hatred with lying lips, and he that uttereth a slander is a fool. Slander is telling a lie or half-truth about someone to make them look bad, to destroy their reputation, to get an advantage over them. God says you're a fool if you do that, because the way you treat others is the way you're going to be treated. Only a fool does that. Let's just flip a page here or two to the 12th chapter. In verse 15 of the 12th chapter, listen carefully to this. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes. In other words, a fool considers himself beyond making mistakes. I don't know if you've heard someone say, I don't make mistakes. I have. And it reminds me of the passage over in 1 John chapter 1 where it says, if we say we have no sin, we make him, God, a liar, and the truth is not in us. A fool doesn't do something. He doesn't engage in self-examination. We all need to look at ourselves and say, here's something I need to change in my life. Here's something I need to do better in my life. And here's something I need to stop. But a fool considers everything he does as great work and right. He has absolutely no place for genuine, honest self-examination. When a Christian comes to eat the Lord's Supper on a Sunday, he is to examine himself. Finding wrong, he needs to make it right with his Lord before he eats. Paul says if we don't, we eat and drink damnation to ourselves. Well, let's go over here to chapter 14. In my Bible, that's just one more page over. In verse 9 of the 14th chapter, fools make a mock at sin. Our world today doesn't mention sin. But fools, according to the Lord, laugh at sin or make fun of it. Folks, sin is disobedience. And the scripture says every sin has a consequence. Paul says some men's sins follow them immediately. In other words, they have an immediate consequence. You know, we know what that means. Some men's sins follow after. They don't catch up with them immediately. But a fool laughs at sin or jokes about it. But it is not a laughing matter, except to a fool. Let's look at one more. Go over here to the 15th chapter. I'll find it here in a minute. Verse 5. A fool despiseth his father's instructions. We're not actually talking about fathers necessarily. We're talking about the fact, and it's mentioned probably a dozen more times in the book of Proverbs. A fool is uninterested in wisdom. A fool is uninterested in listening to good advice. A fool has no love for good knowledge. You don't know how many times my ears have heard young folks who have made some wrong decisions, or maybe they had gotten on drugs and said to me, well, my mama told me I shouldn't do this. A fool does not listen to wisdom. Are you getting the picture? Now take the time sometime and start in the first chapter of Proverbs and read through it and look for the word fool and foolishness. It's going to take you a while. Now we're going to switch our attention now to Psalms. You can turn to it if you want to. It's Psalms 14:1 or chapter 53 verse 1 or Psalm 53 verse 1. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. Now I want you to look at that. Two things. Who says there's no God? A fool. But notice how it's written. The fool says in his heart, there's no God. When a fool says it in his heart, it's something he believes, but not necessarily said. Think about how many people in America have said to themselves, there isn't a God. There isn't a judgment. That's all fairy tales and make-believe. What have they done? They have said in their heart, there is no God. David repeated it in Psalm 53. Same words. The fool says there is no God. There's a reason for it. And David tells us what that reason is. In I'm calling them chapters, but they're Psalms. In Psalms 19, now I'm not going to read it to you. It only has 14 verses, but I want to read the opening verses. The reason David says that a fool says there is no God is he hadn't looked around. Now I'm going to give you permission right now to look out the window. I don't know what you see, but I see the cemetery across the road. But I see those trees. I see those flowers. I see that grass. Psalm 19 reads, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech, nor language, where their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun." Tabernacle for the sun, the rotation. "Which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. His going forth is from the end of heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof." God made nature. Nature didn't make nature. God made nature. And when fall comes, we drive through the countryside and see all of the leaf changing, and we say how beautiful it is, and we spend a lot of time saying, "Have you driven and seen the beautiful leaves? Are they there by accident?" We understand by simply looking at, quote, trees, there's a creator. And the last part of Psalm number 19 is the law of the Lord. David said, just read it, look at it, understand it. That's good. Where'd it come from? The Creator. Now let's go to the New Testament. Let's go to the book of Romans. And I want you to do that, please. Romans chapter 1. The Apostle Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. It is sometimes in the heart of some folks difficult to understand, and there are some difficult passages. But we're not going to leave chapter 1. Okay? When Paul wrote Romans, the Roman government was supreme. It was headed by men that were referred to as Caesar. The word Caesar in the Latin language means king. These Roman leaders governed through a Roman Senate. But one of the things that historians have recorded for us then is that there was much corruption. Immorality among the Caesars was rampant. The general population in Rome had picked up their sins. Rome was a sin city. We must never forget it. The Christians in Rome were not the general population, they were the slaves. The overwhelming majority of the Christians in Rome were slaves. Some of them were slaves for all their life. Some of them were slaves that had purchased their freedom. But they were not the upper classes in Rome. Rome was Sin City. Now, Paul wrote to them, that is the church, and explained to these early Christians that the behavior of their neighbors, including Caesar himself, was disobedience to God. Now, if you read the King James Version, it simply says, they knew God, but they turned away from it. This morning, I want to read it to you from the Phillips translation. Now, the language here is a little easier to understand. Now, you listen carefully to what Paul says about the morality in Rome that exists because there is no God. Now the holy anger of God is disclosed from heaven against the godliness and the evil of those men who render truth dumb and impotent by their wickedness. We're talking about the Roman people. It is not that they do not know the truth about God. Indeed, He has made it quite plain to them. For since the beginning of the world, the invisible attributes of God, His eternal power and deity, have plainly been discernible through the things which He has made, which are commonly seen and known, thus leaving these men without a rag of excuse. Did you hear what Paul said? They ought to know there's a God. Take a look out the window. What man has made a tree? We're just talking about trees. I am thankful for the astronauts that go up into the outer space, and every time they come back, they've learned something more about it. And so those that say there is no God have to find some kind of explanation. And I am thankful for scientists that studies plant and animal life in America. The things they find are unbelievable. We had a horse once named Duke. I don't like horses. They're dirty and they smell. And they kick. But my sister did, and so Dad gave me the job of taking care of the horse. I thought that was wrong. Duke would get out and wander around the neighborhood a while. But he always remembered where he got out and came back. That dumb horse. Well, that's the way God made him. Paul says, you Romans, what's wrong with you? From the very beginning of this world, the nature about us declares the existence of God. Plainly discernible through things which He hath made, and which are commonly seen and known, thus leaving these men without a rag of excuse. This translator is English, so rag of excuse is an English translation. Next sentence. They knew all the time that there was a God, or is a God, yet they refused to acknowledge Him as such, or to thank him for what he is or does. Thus they have become silly in their arguments. I challenge you, read some of the arguments for the theory of evolution. The most silly of all of them is that animals and man himself came from lower forms of life, and it just happened one day that a male bug met a female bug. You think about that. And a gaseous area of the sky one day just lit up, and a amoeba came into existence. It didn't start in America. It started in the time of the Romans. Silly arguments, and they plunged themselves and their silly minds still further into the dark. Who would exchange the glory of the immortal God for an image of a mortal man or of creatures that run, fly, or crawl? They gave up God, and therefore God gave them up to the playthings of their own foul desires in dishonoring their own bodies. What does that sound like to you? Does that sound like any country you might know? What did they do? They knew God, but gave it up, and came up with silly arguments for the existence of ourselves and nature. The next paragraph, Paul hits very hard. We won't take the time, we'll just mention it quickly. Paul condemns their homosexual practices in no uncertain words. You can take your own Bibles and read it. And then we get down to the end of that chapter, which I want to read from Phillips here. Phillips' translation reads, "Moreover, since they considered themselves too high and mighty to acknowledge God." I like that phrase. They considered themselves too high and mighty to believe in God. You know how many things I've read that said, if you believe in God, you have to be uneducated. Educated people don't believe in God. So you're too uneducated, or maybe you're intellectually deficient. God allowed them to become slaves of their degenerate minds and to perform unmentionable deeds. They became filled with violence, wickedness, rottenness, greed, and malice. Their minds became steeped in envy, murder, quarrelsomeness, stabbers in the back, God-haters. They overflowed with pride. By the way, I think we finished Pride Month last month, didn't we? And boastfulness, and their minds teemed with diabolical invention. They scoffed at duty to parents. They mocked at conscience. They recognized no obligations of honor. lost all natural affection, had no use for mercy. More than this, being well aware of God's pronouncement that all who do these things deserve to die, they not only continued their own practices, oh, I like this, but did not hesitate to give their thorough approval to others who did the same. What's the cause? There's no God. Someone has rightly said, if there is no God, there is no morality. There is no right or wrong. It's interesting for me to read some of the writings of the atheist. There's no God. There is no code of a morality. But then they get down to a certain part and says, now you shouldn't do that. Where's that code come from? If there is none. When I think of these things, I think of our country. Folks, we're on the verge of some very, very serious problems. Some of us may not live long enough to see it. But for over 50 years, there has been a movement in this country on the part of some to remove God from the public area. Signs that have promoted something in Scripture about God have been taken down. Public schools have removed God not only from the classroom. When I started teaching, we had Bible reading to begin, a prayer, and teachers in the classroom referred to God quite frequently. That's against the law today. We remove God from everything that's possible. Now, politicians use the name of God, saying, God bless you. And I love the one where they say, we're praying for you. Who are you praying to? Joseph Stalin, the communist dictator of the Soviet Union, an atheist, when he forbid any reference to God, and all religious services were condemned and all of the church buildings closed. But when things got bad, when the Germans invaded Russia, he announced that everybody needs to start praying. I don't know to who. We're following suit, folks. Immorality has always been with us. Sin's always been with us since Adam and Eve. I was wondering this week who Adam and Eve blamed when one of their boys killed another one. Did they blame it on guns? No, they couldn't do that, could they? How did he kill him? We don't know. Some people suggest he picked up a rock and hit him in the head. Did they blame rocks? Sin is a problem of people. Always has been and always will be. But in this country, we are making it a national movement to boast about sin. The most obvious example is homosexuality. Companies, government are falling all over themselves to promote it. Do you remember the last statement that we read from that first chapters? Not only do they practice this kind of sexual immorality, they take pleasure in others who do also. We are rearing a generation of children who first of all know not God, and secondly, a generation of children who believe the good life is accomplished through possessions. The more you got, the happier you'll be. Sadly, late in life, they find out that's not so. We're rearing a generation of folks who are educated beyond many of the previous generations, but they're foolish. Folks, what's wrong? Is our educational system too bad? Is it that we have guns? Is it that we have laws that need to be made that haven't been made? Folks, we need God and the influences of His Word. If you need to respond in some way, do so. Come down the aisle, let me know. While we stand and sing, please.